Support for In the Frame, Exploring the DIA is provided by Masco Corporation Foundation. Masco is a global manufacturer of home improvement and building products.
In 1885, the Detroit Museum of Art opened in a brand new purpose-built building on Jefferson Avenue. In 1919, we changed our name from the Detroit Museum of Art to the Detroit Institute of Arts. In 1927, we moved to our current address, and in the late 60s and early 70s, we added the north and south wings. As the building was growing, so was the collection, and what started with a group of 70 works of art from James Scripps, over the years, through great collectors and specialists, this collection has grown into one of the finest in the world. So today, in 2010, we celebrate 125 years of the Art Museum in Detroit. And to celebrate those 125 years, my curatorial colleagues and I have chosen 125 works. And today, you're going to see a selection, some highlights of that 125. Van Gogh painted this self-portrait in 1887, and when he painted it, he had only been painting for 7 years. It's extraordinary to think of the distance that he came in those 7 years. In 1880, he was barely better than any kind of amateur painter. With this work, he's come to Paris, he's absorbed Impressionism, he's absorbed aspects of post-Impressionism like Pointillism, and he's moving on to be the recognizable late Van Gogh that we all know. Now, this particular picture was acquired by William Valentina, the first director of the Detroit Institute of Arts. And it was in 1922, and can you imagine presenting this kind of work of art in the 1920s to a board of trustees in the Midwest? Well, there were a couple of people on the board back then who were extremely far-sighted. One of them was Ralph Harmon Booth, and the other one was the very young Edsel Ford. But this is the first Van Gogh to enter a US museum. And it's interesting because Valentina was a scholar of Rembrandt, Dutch art, but he loved contemporary art. And one of the reasons he loved contemporary art was because he was friends with some of the German Expressionists. And it was the German Expressionists who came out of Van Gogh. When you look at this wonderful portrait here, you can see there are aspects of Pointillism, Impressionism, but there's also a kind of a twist to the hat, that's the way it's talking, and then this face comes forward in an odd way that isn't really naturalistic. And then, of course, in a kind of spooky, prophetic sense, this ear is very, very red, blood red, in a way that looks forward accidentally to one of the most famous acts of his life. A wonderful picture of an artist, very self-conscious, painted self-portraits often, just like his great forebearer, Rembrandt.
My name is David Penny. I'm the curator of Native American art, and I wanted to show you this mask in our Native American gallery. It's made by a carver who lived on the west coast of Vancouver Island. He belonged to a people known as the Kwakwakiwak, or anthropologists try to make the name a little bit simpler. They call them the Kwakiutl. These people have a tradition of throwing big parties in the winter months, inviting villagers from all over the neighborhood, and presenting big masquerades. So this mask appeared in a large festival known as a potlatch. The mask represents a creature known as Zunokwa, who lives in the woods. She's a big monstrous ogre. She comes into the village at night and steals children away to eat them. So she's regarded as very powerful, but she's also big and clumsy and stupid. So when she's represented in the masquerade, she's often restrained by two attendants who have a rope around her waist, and they hold the ends of the rope, and she dances around the dance house, but she eventually falls asleep in the corner. You can notice that in her eyes, the carver has made her look rather sleepy. Her eyes are only half open. She doesn't have the power of human speech. Her lips are in this permanent O shape because she makes these big grunts and groans like ooh, ooh, reflecting her, she's this monster of the woods. And actually, this particular mask is a great world traveler. It originally was collected from Vancouver Island for a museum in Philadelphia. The museum at that time was called the Museum of Art and Science. But then it went to New York City for the Museum of the American Indian, and then they sold it in the 1930s, and it went to Paris, where it belonged to a collector named Charles Raton, who was very interested in surrealist art. He was interested in these faces, fantastic faces that resembled figures in dreams. So it was very popular among people who were interested in contemporary art. And then we purchased it in 1980, and it's been on display here at the Detroit Institute of Arts ever since.
The DIA's Yogini is a life-sized figure of a goddess made over 1,000 years ago in 950 in a town called Kanchipuram, which is near to Madras in southern India. She was discovered in the 1920s by a French professor at a colonial college in India who excavated her along with 13 other figures that remained from a temple. And the figures were sent to a dealer in Paris called C.T. Lu, a famous Chinese dealer of Asian art, who then sold them to museums in Europe and America, so that all the figures are now distributed across the world. What this figure represents really is one of the multiple facets of Shakti, or the female primordial creative energy of the universe. We can see that she's a goddess by her 4 arms. You can see that in her upper right arm she holds a club, and the upper left arm a shield. Her lower left arm holds a skull cup, like most of the other figures that are known from this temple. These figures have been described as seductive but dangerous, and you can see that the body of the goddess is flexible, lithe, strong, voluptuous, and yet she holds signs of death at the same time that she's life-giving, the skull cup, but also the headless corpse carved into the base here, like on many of the other figures from this site. She has that lovely, inviting smile, which is tinged with pointed fangs, and her, beautiful face is accented with eyebrows that are really almost like little snakes. What's interesting also about these kind of figures is that they embody some ideas of Tantrism. Tantric thought, in a way, talks about transgressing social taboos in order to gain power, as it were. And you can see with her unbound hair that she's transgressing a social taboo about the way women should be dressed. And we see that also with the headless corpse, in the sense that there's some very dark tantric practices that might include eating pieces of corpses. Transgressing actually one of the most basic human taboos as a way of achieving some level of power. So really, she's really one of the most fabulous sculptural figures that we have in the museum's collection, but she's indeed a very powerful figure that embodies such contrasts. One scholar called her lovely but lethal, and I think that's a very apt way to describe her.
This painting is by Georges Seurat, who was a French painter who lived in France at the end of the 19th century. He is the founder of the Neo-Impressionist movement. Neo-Impressionist artists inspired themselves in the Impressionist movement, but applied scientific and color theories to their paintings. They actually use a technique called the pointillism. This technique is basically the application of colors or primary colors and little dots on the surface of the canvas. The term Neo-Impressionism was coined by the art critic Félix Fénéon, who happened to own this painting for many years. During the summer of 1889, Seurat moved to the little village of Les Crotois in the north of France and started to do sand landscapes. Seurat in these paintings represent the moment of the low tide, and you can see the dunes emerging out of the water. He was especially interested in representing the luminosity of colors to render the radiation of the light in the landscape. And for that, he used a specific technique. He used his pointillism technique using primary colors, but he also painted the frame of the painting with complementary colors to the colors in the canvas. This painting is especially important at the DIA and also especially important in the history of art. This is because it has preserved its original frame. This is the frame that Seurat used and painted to give that luminosity, special luminosity, to his view of Les Crotois. Only 10 paintings in the world are known to have kept their original painted frames by Seurat.
This painting may not be familiar to you as many other paintings in the DIA, but it's one of those works that when my colleagues come here, other directors, and we walk into this gallery, they say, "Oh, right, you've got that picture." It's one of the iconic paintings of the Romantic movement. It was painted by a man called Henry Fuseli, born in Switzerland, but moved to England early in his career and anglicized his name. And when it was shown, and he had a bit of a reputation as a strange man too, so when this painting was shown, people were, well, initially baffled by it because it doesn't have a subject matter. It doesn't have a story that you, even if it's obscure, you can track it down somewhere in literature. Nobody knew what to make of it, except, of course, some clergymen decided that it was obscene and that this kind of thing should not be shown to the general public. But what you see, of course, first is this woman lying on her bed, stretched out in a very vulnerable position with the goblin on top. And that is the mare of nightmare. It comes from the Old English word mara, and it meant a goblin or a witch. And so the witch or the goblin is sitting on the chest of this woman, giving her the nightmares. And in the background, you see a mare, which presumably references the mare part of it, the horse part of it, that most people like me used to think of immediately. Now, it was painted in 1781, the height of the American Revolutionary War. And this painting was seized upon immediately by cartoonists. And one particular political cartoon, they turned the woman into George III. The goblin was Lord North, and in the background there were the revolutionary figures themselves. And interestingly enough, this picture was at an exhibition in England a few years ago at the Tate Gallery. In fact, it was the center of an exhibition about Gothic nightmare, this kind of painting. And a cartoon appeared in one of the newspapers that showed the woman as Tony Blair, the goblin sitting on top of Tony Blair was George Bush, and the figure lurking in the background was Dick Cheney. So this picture lives even a couple of hundred years after it was first painted. A very strange painting, a wonderful picture that, as I said at the beginning, has become an icon of Romantic art.
Artist William T. Williams emerged on the New York art scene in the late 1960s, a time of complex political, social, and artistic change. The Flute Player, which was painted by Williams in 1992, is one in a series of paintings that he began to develop in the late 1980s. It was inspired by his memories of the light and color that shone through the windows of his aunt's apartment in Harlem, New York, and this particular series to which the flute player belongs is regarded as one that expresses his achievement in trying to unify his personal history and artistic history in his work. Like the flute player, all the related paintings in this series feature this compositional grid composed of rectangles in various widths and lengths. You also see his use of primary and earth tone colors here in the painting. And when you look at the surface, which I think is the thing that fascinates most people when they see the painting, there's this wonderful encrusted surface. You know, there probably are maybe something like about 15 layers of paint on the canvas, and the technique he used tends to open up the surface so that you can see these various layers. So there's this cracked surface as well. If you look at it, you just see these layers of different colors underneath the surface. The flute player, I think when you look at it, makes it evident why William T. Williams is regarded by fellow artists as a master colorist. But besides his sort of brilliant use of a very distinct palette, he also, I think, demonstrates his ability to bring order to this very expressionist painting. You know, his skill in developing different techniques. When you look at the painting close up, you also see an area here where the technique is somewhat different than what you see in other areas of the painting. But that is reminiscent of a technique he used in one of his previous series. So what he's doing is bringing all that history into this new series of paintings, and this painting demonstrates that very well.
This is one of my most favorite works of art in the Detroit Institute of Art's European collection. It is by Martin Carlin and a jewel coffer, or a jewel cabinet, made about 1774 in Paris by one of the great ébénistes, or master furniture makers. He was of German descent who came to Paris to learn the trade of making the finest French furniture. He started out as a simple cabinet maker, but interestingly enough, married the sister of a master ébéniste, and by 1766 became a master ébéniste himself. Within 10 years, he was able to make this extraordinary piece with the cabriole, or curved legs, these wonderful gilt bronzes that connect to these exotic woods made of tulip wood, amaranth, and holly, and working with an interior decorator called a merchant mercier named Gogh, they acquired from the Sèvres porcelain manufactory these soft paste Sèvres plaques that are decorated. This is a unique, very wonderful example, decorated with 13 Sèvres porcelain plaques showing single and double roses and rosebuds on the center and on all but the backside of this cabinet. It contained jewels, it contained precious objects. It was a treasured and very special piece. There are only 8 similar jewel cabinets or coffers by Martin Carlin, and this one is the only one to have the wonderful white ground porcelain plaques with the roses.
This magnificent door represents one of the DIA's most important works of art from Africa. It is a door carved by the Yoruba artist known as Olowe of Ise. The door was originally carved for the royal palace of Ikere, a Yoruba town in southwestern Nigeria. Olowe was known to have worked exclusively for royalty in southwestern Nigeria among his Yoruba people. And this door represents one of his finest works. Olowe was known to have been a master carver. He carved in such extraordinary style that most people consider to be unique. First of all, when you look at the piece, Olowe typically carved his works from a single block of wood. And the side of the door to the right here was carved from a single block with no piece carved separately and placed on top of the work. What you see here is Olowe's style, which has been celebrated by academics. It is this very, very high relief carving of human figures. As you can see, the figures seem to be popping off from the background. Olowe was also known to provide some movement. The illusion of movement is provided by placing one foot in front of the other. In addition, Olowe was also very, very good at using color. Olowe applied pigments to the surface, and as you can see, it makes the work extremely lively. What is also critical in observing Olowe's unique style is the fact that he left very few areas undecorated. Even the background against which the figures were placed were decorated with various designs. One of the things that we find exciting about this door is the fact that Olowe divided the scenes into two segments. What is critical about this door is the fact that within the same door, Olowe manages to capture the daily life of the palace and then goes on to also capture scenes that allow the king to access information about his past and his future through the divination process. And it makes this door such a wonderful piece of work by Olowe to see in the gallery.
When Francis Bacon saw the photographs coming out of the concentration camps at the end of World War II, he said words to the effect that painting was impotent in the face of this kind of subject matter. But as you can see, well, he was still drawn to those kinds of things. This is called a study for a crouching nude. And you see a somewhat dismembered male in the middle here with his head, if that is his head there, looking up, back at it. And the figure seems to be inside a glass box. Perhaps this is a reference to some of the way that some of the people at the Nuremberg trials were treated, but clearly this is a figure in real pain. The box itself is then surrounded by this circular form, which gives more and more of a sense of entrapment, a sense of a scream somewhat coming out of this painting. And then unusually, very unusually for modern and contemporary art, Bacon actually liked to put glass on his paintings, because then reflections, you looking at this picture or looking sideways, see other things, your world, the real world, was drawn into this particular painted world that's two-dimensional but still has sort of sense of being in the three dimensions.
I've been a member of the DIA for 14 years, and I became a member after I decided to become a volunteer. Being a volunteer at the DIA gives me great pleasure because I have contact with the public through doing tours for the public, and I have contact with children, school groups coming in who I do tours for also. And being able to impart what I have learned to these young people is very satisfying, and I get a lot of gratification out of that. The Detroit Institute of Arts is extremely important to the city. It is a source of education, and it's a source of culture to the city, and it's very important for this institution to be able to survive and provide the service to the city that the city needs.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode looking at a selection of the works chosen from the 125 pieces the curators and I have selected to celebrate our 125th anniversary. I hope you'll come down and pick your own 125 favorites. For a full listing of our programs, go to dia.org. Until next time, this is Graham Beale, your guide to one of America's great art museums, the Detroit Institute of Arts.
Support for In the Frame, Exploring the DIA is provided by Masco Corporation Foundation. Masco is a global manufacturer of home improvement and building products. An encore presentation of In the Frame is available on demand for viewing at DetroitPublicTV.org.